The alarm on my console did not blink red. It blinked a strange shade of violet, a color I had never seen assigned to any warning before, and that single detail told me something had gone wrong, in a way our systems were not built to handle. I was 3 hours into a night shift at Kestrel Relay, the small listening station humanity kept anchored at the edge of contested space, and I was the only person awake in the signal room when the transmission arrived. My name is Ellen Brooks. I was not a soldier. I was a communications analyst, the kind of person who spent her days sorting through static and stray radio chatter, looking for patterns that meant something. That night, the pattern found me instead. The violet alert meant an unrecognized broadcast protocol, something our translation systems had never cataloged, arriving on every frequency at once. Not one channel, every channel, civilian, military, emergency, deep space relay, even the maintenance bands nobody used anymore. Whatever was speaking wanted to be heard by everyone, everywhere, all at the same moment. I opened the feed. A voice filled the room, deep and layered, as if 100 throats were speaking in perfect unison. The language processor took 4 full seconds to catch up, an eternity for a machine that usually translated in real time. When the words finally resolved into English, I understood why it had struggled. The syntax was built for ceremony, not conversation. To the species known as humanity, the voice said, the Zorathi Empire, eternal and unbroken across 11,000 years of dominion, does hereby declare a state of formal war. Your colony at the edge of our sacred boundary has committed an unforgivable insult against imperial dignity. Your representatives refused the kneeling of recognition before our envoy. This affront cannot stand unanswered. Prepare your worlds. Prepare your fleets. Prepare your children. The Empire's judgment will arrive, and it will not be gentle. The message looped. Then it looped again. I sat there listening to it a third time, waiting for the part where it made sense, waiting for context that never came. An empire I had never heard of, citing a diplomatic meeting I had never heard of, over an act of disrespect that sounded, when I really thought about it, like someone had simply declined to bow. I pulled up the incident report buried in our diplomatic archive. It took me 11 minutes to find it, an almost comically minor footnote from 4 months earlier. A trade envoy from a species calling itself the Zorathi had visited one of our outer colonies, a farming settlement called Ashworth's Landing, population roughly 6,000. The envoy had requested that the colony administrator kneel during the greeting ceremony, as was apparently customary when meeting an imperial representative. The administrator, a woman named Grace Whitfield, who I would later come to know quite well, had declined. Her exact recorded words were, and I quote, "That's not really how we do handshakes around here." That was it. That was the incident. A woman said no to kneeling, and somewhere out among the stars, an empire 11,000 years old had decided this meant war. I should have been afraid. I understood that later, when I had time to sit with everything that followed. In the moment, sitting alone in that quiet signal room, with a declaration of war looping on every channel in known space, what I actually felt was something closer to confusion, followed quickly by a strange, creeping urge to laugh, which I suppressed, because laughing alone at 3 in the morning felt like the beginning of a bad turn. I did what my training told me to do. I flagged the transmission as Priority 1, logged the timestamp, and sent it up the chain to my supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Daniel Hart, who answered his comm on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Ellen," he said, "this better be good." I told him what I had. I read him the message, word for word, and there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Say that again," he said, "the part about the kneeling." I said it again. Another pause. Then Daniel exhaled, and I heard the particular sound of a man rubbing his face with one hand, the universal gesture of someone deciding whether the situation in front of him was serious or absurd, and possibly both at once. "Okay," he said. "Forward it to command. I'll be in within the hour. Don't touch anything else on that channel until I get there." I forwarded it. I sat back in my chair and looked at the star field on the far wall display. The calm, patient blackness of space stretching out beyond our little station, utterly indifferent to what had just been declared within it. Somewhere out there, an empire was mobilizing because a farmer had refused to bend her knees. By the time the sun came up over the relay station's simulated day cycle, The message had reached every major broadcast network on Earth, and every colony world humanity had ever settled. I expected panic. I expected the kind of chaos you see in old recordings of disasters. People flooding the streets, emergency sirens, that particular electric tension in the air when everyone realizes the world has changed overnight. What I got instead, when I finally stepped outside the station's observation deck and pulled up the public feeds on my tablet, was almost disappointing in its ordinariness. The declaration of war was indeed the top story on every network. It ran beneath serious-looking anchors with serious-looking graphics. A countdown clock even appeared on one channel, ticking toward some vague and unspecified moment of reckoning. But scroll down, just slightly, and the story competed for attention with a scheduling dispute in a regional sports league, a bakery in Lisbon that had invented a new pastry, and a mildly controversial ruling in a cooking competition that had apparently been rigged. The comment sections beneath the war declaration were, to put it mildly, not what I expected from a species facing annihilation. Someone had already turned the phrase, kneeling of recognition, into a meme, complete with an image of a very unimpressed cat. Another comment simply read, "So are they going to reschedule the game or what?" A third, which had accumulated several thousand approving reactions by the time I read it, said, "An empire that's been around 11,000 years, and their whole plan is getting mad because somebody wouldn't curtsy. Sounds like a them problem." I stood there on the observation deck, coffee cooling in my hand, and felt something shift in my understanding of my own species. I had grown up on stories of old wars, the ones from before humanity looked outward, conflicts that had shaped entire generations with grief and fear. I had assumed, without ever really examining the assumption, that a threat from beyond the stars would finally be the thing that broke through humanity's stubborn calm. It did not seem to be working that way. Daniel arrived at the station, looking like a man who had slept in his uniform, which he had. He found me still on the observation deck and handed me a printed copy of the transmission, an old habit of his, insisting that important things existed on paper as well as screens. "Command's response came in," he said. "Want to guess what it says?" I said I had no idea. He handed me a second printout. It was short. Standard operational tempo maintained. No change to civilian advisories. Border patrols continue on existing schedule. Fleet command monitoring situation. "That's it," I said. "That's the whole response." "That's the whole response!" Daniel confirmed. No evacuation order. No martial law. No emergency broadcast telling people to stay indoors. Just, and I'm paraphrasing here, keep doing what you were doing. I read it twice, looking for something I had missed, some hidden layer of urgency buried in the bureaucratic language. There wasn't one. It really did just say, more or less, carry on. I asked Daniel if that seemed strange to him, and he gave me a look I would come to recognize over the following weeks, a look that mixed patience with something like fondness, the look of someone explaining a family joke to a person who had just married into the family. "Ellen," he said, "how many times in the last 200 years has some group somewhere declared that humanity was finished? Not counting our own conflicts, just the outside stuff. Rogue asteroid predictions, solar flare panics, 3 separate first contact incidents before this one that all fizzled into trade agreements. We've had 4 different alien species show up at our door in my lifetime alone, and exactly none of them have managed to actually rattle anybody past the first news cycle." I told him this felt different. This one used the word war. He nodded slowly, conceding the point. "Maybe it is different," he said. "But you'll notice Command didn't panic either, and Command has information we don't. If they thought this was a 5-alarm situation, we wouldn't be standing here having a leisurely conversation about it over bad coffee. We'd be running drills right now." He was right about the coffee at least. It really was bad. Over the following days, I watched the story unfold with the strange, detached fascination of someone observing a chemical reaction they did not fully understand. The Zorathi Empire, it turned out, had a well-documented history stretching back through galactic records that other species had shared with humanity during earlier diplomatic exchanges. They were old, disciplined, and had subdued dozens of lesser civilizations through a careful combination of overwhelming force and psychological theater. Their declarations of war were, by design, meant to be terrifying. The ritual language, the countdown clocks embedded in their own broadcasts, the deliberate references to children and homes. All of it was calculated to break the will of a target civilization before a single ship ever launched. It worked, historically. I read through archived accounts, provided to us by a neutral trading species called the Threnian, who had encountered the Zarathi generations earlier. Entire planets had surrendered before the first Zarathi fleet arrived, simply because the declaration itself was so effective at inducing despair. Populations evacuated their own capitals. Governments collapsed under the psychological weight of anticipation. In one particularly grim account, an entire species had voted to disband their military and offer immediate unconditional surrender, hoping it might earn them better treatment, which, according to the same records, it had not. Humanity's response, by comparison, looked almost insulting. Stock markets barely twitched. School schedules did not change. A popular late-night television host opened his show that week with a joke about the Zarathi needing better public relations, suggesting they lead with a firmer offer next time, maybe some kind of loyalty program. I began to understand, slowly, that this was not naivety. It was something closer to muscle memory. Daniel explained it to me one evening, as we watched the feeds together in the station's small break room, the two of us, and a pot of coffee that had, for once, turned out drinkable. "We've had bad things happen before," he said. "Really bad things. Things that make one grumpy empire look almost quaint by comparison. And every single time, the thing that actually got us through wasn't fear. Fear makes people freeze. What got us through was people showing up to work the next day anyway, because someone had to keep the lights on, keep the food moving, keep the kids in school. That habit doesn't just disappear because a new threat shows up wearing a fancier uniform." I asked him if he was ever afraid, personally, about what was coming. He thought about it for a long moment, turning his mug slowly on the table. "Sure," he said. "I'd be a fool not to be. A little. But being afraid and being frozen are two different things. I can be afraid and still show up to my shift. That's kind of the whole trick." 3 days after the declaration, our station received an update that finally gave the abstract threat a shape. Long-range sensors, shared through the same Threnian network that had given us the historical records, picked up movement. A Zarathi fleet, substantial in size, had begun mobilizing from a staging point several systems away. Estimated numbers put it at 140 warships, organized in the kind of tight, disciplined formation that suggested centuries of standardized doctrine. I remember staring at that number on my display, 140, and trying to feel the fear that seemed like the obviously correct response. What I felt instead was something more like professional curiosity, the same feeling I imagine a meteorologist gets watching a hurricane form on satellite imagery, aware of the danger in an abstract sense, but mostly just interested in the shape of the thing. Daniel came to look over my shoulder, arms crossed, studying the formation data with the same calm he brought to everything. "Standard Zarathi wedge," he said. "Command's already seen this pattern before, from the historical records the Threnian shared. It's designed to look unstoppable on a sensor screen. Real intimidating, if you've never seen anything like it." "Have you seen anything like it?" I asked. He almost smiled. "Not exactly like it," he admitted. "But I've seen enough formations in my life to know that a pretty shape on a screen doesn't win anything by itself. Ships still have to fight the fight in front of them." That night, I could not sleep. Not from fear exactly, though I suppose fear was somewhere in the mixture. It was more that my mind kept turning the entire situation over, trying to find the angle from which it made sense. An empire 11,000 years old, powerful enough to have subdued dozens of worlds through fear alone, had looked at humanity, judged us worth destroying over a diplomatic slight, and expected the same collapse it had always gotten before. Instead, we had gone to work the next morning. I lay in my narrow bunk aboard the station, listening to the quiet hum of the life support systems, and thought about all the stories I had grown up with, stories about humanity's older wars, the ones that had taught an entire species a particular kind of endurance, the ones that had left behind not despair, but a strange, stubborn refusal to be shaken easily by anything after. I thought about how history sometimes prepares a people for a fight they cannot yet see coming, sharpening something in them long before the actual threat arrives. I did not know yet how the war would go. Nobody on Kestrel Station did, not even Daniel with all his calm certainty. But I remember the exact feeling I had that first night, staring at the ceiling above my bunk, and it was not the feeling of someone bracing for the end of the world. It was the feeling of someone who suspected, quietly and without quite being able to explain why, that the empire calling itself eternal and unbroken had just made a very serious miscalculation, and that somewhere out among the stars, 140 warships were sailing toward a species that had simply forgotten, a long time ago, how to be properly afraid of things like this. The violet alert on my console eventually faded back to its usual color. The looping declaration kept playing on background channels, growing almost comforting in its repetition, the way a familiar song becomes wallpaper after enough listens. Life at Kestrel Station continued exactly as Daniel had predicted. Shifts rotated, reports got filed. Someone complained about the coffee. And somewhere beyond the edge of our sensors, an empire that measured its confidence in millennia was about to learn precisely how little that confidence was worth against a species that had simply never learned to be impressed by declarations, no matter how ancient the throat that made them. I finished my shift that morning the same way I finished every shift, logging my reports, updating the duty roster, and heading to the small canteen for a meal I barely tasted. Around me, other analysts and technicians moved through their routines with the same unbothered rhythm they always had. Someone was arguing cheerfully about a card game from the night before. Someone else was complaining about a delayed supply shipment. Nobody was talking about the war, not because nobody cared, but because caring, for humans, apparently did not require constant conversation about the thing you cared about. It required showing up and doing the work in front of you, and trusting that everyone else would do the same. I did not know yet that within days, the calm indifference I had witnessed that first week would become the single most talked about mystery among every other species watching from the shadows of this unfolding conflict. I did not know that alien diplomats across a dozen neutral worlds were already gathering in emergency sessions, trying and failing to understand a species that had been handed a declaration of total war and had responded, essentially, by shrugging and asking what was for dinner. All I knew, standing in that canteen with a tray of food I barely wanted, was that something enormous was coming, and that the species I belonged to seemed almost entirely unbothered by that fact. Whether that unbothered calm was wisdom or foolishness, I could not yet say. I would find out soon enough. We all would. The first week after the declaration passed the way most weeks pass, which is to say with a strange, almost comic ordinariness that I found myself documenting in my personal notes, half convinced that someone, someday, would want a record of how a species behaved on the edge of what should have been catastrophe. Kestrel Station kept its normal rotation. Supply ships arrived on schedule, unbothered escorts trading gossip with the dock crew the same way they always had. The station's small school, run for the handful of children whose families lived aboard in long-term postings, held its lessons without interruption, and I remember passing the observation window one afternoon and seeing a dozen kids drawing pictures of the starfield outside, one of them proudly showing off a crayon rendering of what she insisted was a Zarathi warship, though it looked considerably more like a friendly whale with too many fins. Daniel found me at my console a few days into that stretch, holding a tablet with a grin that told me he had something he wanted to show me. "You have to see this," he said, sliding the tablet across the desk. It was a clip from a planetary broadcast back on Earth, a talk show segment where the host had invited a panel of what the show called experts, though I suspected at least one of them was simply a well-known comedian, to discuss the ongoing situation with the Zarathi Empire. The audience laughed through most of it. One panelist suggested that if the Zarathi truly cared so much about kneeling, humanity should simply offer to teach them a proper handshake instead, since it seemed like the actual source of the miscommunication. Another panelist, drier in tone, pointed out that humanity had survived plenty of leaders throughout history who also demanded excessive displays of submission, and none of them had lasted particularly long either. The segment ended with the host turning to the camera and saying, in a tone somewhere between genuine reassurance and comic theater, "Listen, folks, I know this sounds scary. An empire, a war, all of it. But take a breath. We've survived worse from within our own species. We'll manage this too. Now, in other news, let's talk about the weather." I watched Daniel laugh at the segment, and I laughed too, though a part of me still expected some deeper current of anxiety to be running beneath the surface of everyone I spoke with. I kept looking for it, the way you search a room for a sound you thought you heard, and I kept not finding it. What I found instead, over that first week, was something closer to a quiet, background awareness, present in nearly everyone, but never allowed to interrupt the actual business of living. People checked the news. People discussed the situation in passing, over meals, in hallways, during breaks. But nobody stopped going to work. Nobody stopped raising their children, tending their gardens, running their businesses, playing their games. It was as though the entire species had collectively decided that dread, while acknowledged, simply was not going to be allowed a seat at the table of daily life. It was during this week that I met Vale, though meeting is perhaps too formal a word for how it happened. Kestrel Station occasionally hosted neutral observers from allied and unaligned species, representatives of civilizations that maintained trade relationships with humanity, but had not yet chosen sides in any larger galactic conflicts. Vale Ashenlight was one such observer, a member of the Threnian people, a species I had only ever seen in briefing photographs before that week. The Threnian were tall, slender, with skin that shifted color subtly depending on their emotional state, a trait that made them notoriously difficult to bluff in negotiations, since their own biology tended to betray them. Vale had been stationed aboard Kestrel for several months prior to the declaration, monitoring trade routes on behalf of a small consortium of neutral worlds. I had exchanged polite greetings with them once or twice in the station corridors, but our first real conversation happened in the observation lounge, 4 days after the declaration, when I found them standing at the viewport with their pale skin tinged an unmistakable shade of gray, a color I had read, in an old briefing packet, corresponded roughly to human dread. "Ellen," they said, without turning from the window, "I have been meaning to ask you something, and I am not certain how to phrase it politely." I told them politeness was optional between colleagues, and they turned to face me. Their expression, insofar as Threnian faces conveyed expression at all, arranged in something that looked remarkably like concern. "Your species has been declared war upon by an empire that has ended civilizations far older and far more prepared than yours," they said. "I have reviewed your public broadcasts. I have reviewed your governmental statements. I find no evidence of appropriate alarm anywhere in your society. I must ask you directly, is this a display for our benefit, some manner of psychological deterrence aimed at the Zorathi, or does your species genuinely fail to understand the danger it now faces?" I considered the question carefully before answering, because I understood, even then, that Vale was not simply making conversation. They were genuinely troubled, and their concern, once I sat with it, did not feel unreasonable. I told them it was not a display. There was no secret committee coordinating humanity's calm reaction for strategic effect. As far as I knew, and I told them this honestly, humanity's lack of panic was simply humanity being humanity. The same species that had weathered its own long history of conflict and disaster, without losing the habit of getting up the next morning and going back to work. Vale's skin shifted further toward gray as I spoke, and I realized, with some surprise, that my attempt at reassurance was having the opposite effect. "That is precisely what troubles me," they said. "A species that does not fear consequences is either supremely capable or supremely foolish, and history has shown me far more examples of the latter than the former. I have watched entire civilizations vanish because their leadership refused to acknowledge danger until it arrived at their doorstep. I do not wish to watch that happen to people I have come to consider friends." I did not have a perfect answer for them that day, and I told them so honestly. I explained what Daniel had told me, about muscle memory, about the strange comfort humanity seemed to draw from having survived its own darkest chapters, about the idea that fear, while present, did not have to be allowed to run the show. Vale listened carefully, their color slowly shifting from gray toward a paler, more contemplative blue, though it never fully returned to what I understood to be their neutral tone. "I do not think you are foolish, Ellen," they said eventually. "I have known you long enough to believe you are thoughtful and capable, but I have also studied the Zorathi, and I know what their declarations have preceded before. I would ask that you consider, seriously, whether calm confidence and denial can sometimes wear the same face." Their words stayed with me for the rest of that day, turning over in my mind as I worked through my shift, cataloging incoming transmissions, most of which were mundane trade signals utterly unrelated to the unfolding crisis. I kept thinking about the distinction Vale had drawn between confidence and denial, and wondering, privately, which one I was actually witnessing in my own species. 2 days later, Vale came to find me again, and this time, their color had shifted decisively toward the pale, urgent tone I now recognized as fear. "I am leaving," they told me, standing in the doorway of the signal room with a travel case already in hand. "The consortium I represent has ordered a full withdrawal of all neutral observers from human territory. Several allied worlds along the border are already evacuating civilian populations. I wish to tell you in person, rather than simply vanish from the station without explanation." I asked them where they were going, and they named a system several jumps away, well outside what anyone believed to be the projected path of the Zorathi advance. "I do not expect you to understand my caution," they said, and there was something almost apologetic in the way they said it, as if they felt the need to justify a decision that, from their perspective, required no justification at all. "I have watched this pattern before, Ellen. Ritual declaration, followed by mobilization, followed by conquest. Every time, the target civilization either surrenders swiftly, softening the eventual blow, or resists and suffers greatly for the resistance. I do not wish to remain in a location that fits so precisely into a pattern I have seen play out badly so many times before." I asked them, somewhat desperately, whether they truly believed humanity could not defend itself. "I do not know what your species is capable of," they admitted. "That is precisely the problem. I have never encountered a civilization that responded to a Zorathi declaration the way yours has. I cannot tell if your calm is a strength I have never seen before, or a weakness dressed in unfamiliar clothing. I have decided I am not willing to remain and find out at close range." We stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their decision settling between us. I felt, in that moment, a small crack open in my own confidence, the first genuine doubt I had allowed myself since the declaration first arrived. Vale was not a coward. I had worked alongside them long enough to know that. Their fear was informed by knowledge I did not have, centuries of galactic history that painted a far grimmer picture than the one my own species seemed willing to entertain. I asked them, before they left, what they thought would actually happen, if they had to guess. They considered the question for a long moment, their color settling into something I had not seen from them before, a deep, contemplative violet that I did not have a translation for in my own emotional vocabulary. "I hope I am wrong about you," they said finally. "I have hoped that about very few things in my long life. Please, Ellen, if your calm is confidence rather than denial, prove it. I would be glad, more than glad, to return one day and discover that I fled unnecessarily. I would apologize for my caution with genuine relief." They left that evening, aboard a departing supply vessel bound for the neutral system they had named. I watched their ship depart from the observation lounge, the same spot where we had first spoken days earlier, and felt a strange, hollow ache in the pit of my stomach that I had not expected. It was not fear for myself, exactly. It was something closer to the discomfort of being seen from the outside, of having a trusted friend look at your entire civilization and conclude that the safest course of action was distance. Daniel found me still standing there some time later, staring out at the empty space where Vale's ship had been. "Heard the news," he said quietly, coming to stand beside me, "about the evacuations along the border." I told him about my conversation with Vale, about the pattern they had described, about the hollow feeling their departure had left behind. Daniel listened without interrupting, his usual calm present but tempered, this time, with something more serious. "I won't pretend I know exactly how this ends," he said eventually. "Nobody does, not really. Not command, not the fleet, not anybody. But I'll tell you what I do know. Your friend has seen this pattern play out with a lot of other species that maybe didn't have what we have. That doesn't mean the pattern has to repeat here. Patterns break. They break precisely when somebody finally shows up who doesn't fit the mold the pattern was built around." I asked him how he could be so certain humanity was that somebody. "I'm not certain," he admitted. "Nobody gets to be certain about the future. But I've read enough history to know that overconfident empires have a way of running into people they underestimated, and it usually goes worse for the empire than they expect. I'm not saying we're guaranteed to win. I'm saying I'd rather bet on us than against us, and I've got decent reasons for that bet, even if I can't promise you the odds." Over the following days, the departures continued. Neutral trading vessels that had once been a common sight around Kestrel Station grew scarce. Diplomatic postings from allied but non-human species thinned out, their representatives recalled to safer territory. It became, in its own quiet way, a kind of unintentional test, watching to see which species would remain and which would retreat, a slow sorting of the galaxy into those willing to stand near humanity in this moment, and those who judged the risk too great. What surprised me most watching this unfold was that humanity's own posture did not shift in response. There was no bitterness toward the departing allies, no public campaign shaming them for their caution. Official statements, when they addressed the withdrawals at all, did so with what I can only describe as understanding, even generosity. One planetary spokesperson, asked directly about the evacuations during a press briefing, simply said that every species had the right to protect its people according to its own judgment, and that humanity held no ill will toward friends who chose caution over risk. I found myself thinking about that statement often in the days that followed, turning it over the way I had turned over Vale's parting words. There was something in humanity's reaction, or lack of reaction, that I was only beginning to understand as more than simple stubbornness. It was not that we believed ourselves invincible. It was that we had made peace, somewhere deep in our collective history, with the idea that fear was a poor advisor, and that the only real answer to an uncertain future was to keep doing the work in front of you, one day at a time, and trust that the sum of many ordinary days, lived without panic, would eventually add up to something that could weather even an empire's wrath. Whether that trust was wisdom or foolishness, I still could not say with certainty. But as the last of the neutral ships departed Kestrel Station's docking ring, and the station settled into a quieter, more solitary rhythm, I found myself hoping, with a fierceness that surprised me, that Daniel's bet on humanity would prove to be the right one. Because somewhere beyond the thinning crowd of allies and observers, 140 Zorathi warships were still advancing, patient and disciplined, entirely convinced that the species waiting for them at the border had already lost this war the moment it failed to properly understand how frightened it was supposed to be. 3 weeks after the declaration, I stood in the docking bay of Kestrel Station and watched the last neutral cargo vessel undock, its running lights fading into the dark as it turned away from human territory for what its captain had told Daniel, quite plainly, might be a very long time. I had grown almost used to these farewells by then, though each one still carried its own particular weight. This departure was different, though, because the captain leaving was someone I had come to know personally over the preceding weeks, a Threnian trader named Osa Renfeld who had docked at Kestrel regularly enough that we had developed something like a friendship, built mostly around shared meals in the station canteen and her genuine curiosity about human customs, which she found endlessly, delightfully strange. She found me in the observation lounge before her departure, her skin cycling through a mixture of colors I had learned to read as a kind of anxious affection, worry layered over something warmer. "I do not want to leave you here, Ellen," she said, without preamble. "I have grown fond of you, and fondness makes leaving harder, not easier, contrary to what the old sayings suggest." I told her I understood, and that I did not resent her decision, though I admitted, honestly, that watching so many friends and allies depart in such a short span of time had left a hollow feeling in my chest that I had not fully learned to sit with. She studied me for a long moment, her expression difficult to read but her tone, when she spoke again, gentle. "May I ask you something plainly?" she said, "and I promise it comes from care, not judgment." I told her she could ask me anything. "Why do you not beg me to stay?" she asked. "Why do none of you beg any of us to stay? I have watched entire crews from other trading vessels depart human space over these past weeks, and not once have I heard a human plead with them to remain. Not once have I seen anger at those who choose to go. I find this the strangest thing about your species, stranger even than your calm in the face of the declaration itself." I thought about her question for a while before answering, because it was a fair one, and it deserved more than a reflexive response. I told her that I thought humanity had learned, somewhere along its long and difficult history, that asking someone to risk themselves for your comfort was a kind of selfishness dressed up as connection. That if she needed to leave to protect herself, to protect her crew, to protect the people back home who loved her, then asking her to stay simply because her presence made our fear more bearable would have been asking her to carry a burden that was never truly hers to carry. Osa's coloring shifted again, something that looked almost like sorrow passing briefly across her features. "That is either the wisest thing I have heard a human say," she said quietly, "or the loneliest. I confess I am not certain which." "Perhaps it is both," I told her, and she laughed, a soft musical sound that Threnian physiology produced somewhere in their chest rather than their throat, and for a moment, the heaviness of the docking bay lifted just slightly. Before she boarded her vessel, she pressed something into my hand, a small polished stone, cool and smooth, the kind of trinket Threnian traders carried, as tokens of goodwill between trusted partners. "Keep this," she said. "When this is over, whatever over comes to mean, I intend to return and reclaim it from you in person. Consider it collateral against my own cowardice, a promise that I have not abandoned you so much as postponed our friendship until the danger passes." I held the stone long after her ship had cleared the docking ring, turning it over in my fingers, and found myself smiling despite everything, a strange, small warmth in the midst of so much uncertainty. Daniel found me still standing there some time later, and when I showed him the stone and explained what Osa had said, he nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "You know," he said, "I think that's the thing people from outside our species keep missing. They read our calm as recklessness, or ignorance, or maybe even arrogance. But it's none of those things. It's just that we've made peace with not controlling everything. We can't control who stays and who goes. We can't control what the Zarathi decide to throw at us next. All we can actually control is whether we keep showing up for each other and for the work in front of us, and whether we hold on to the good things, like a friend's promise to come back for a rock, even while the bad things are happening around us." I asked him if he ever worried that our calm might genuinely be misplaced, that perhaps species like the Threnian understood something crucial about the Zarathi that we simply did not. He was quiet for a moment, watching the empty space beyond the viewport where Osa's ship had disappeared. "Sure, I worry about that," he admitted. "Anybody who tells you they don't worry at all is either lying or not paying attention. But worry and paralysis aren't the same thing, Ellen. I can hold both, the worry and the work, at the same time. I think most of us can. I think that's actually the whole trick of getting through anything hard. You don't wait for the fear to go away before you act. You act with the fear still sitting right there next to you, uninvited but tolerated." Over the following days, word began to spread through the remaining crew and staff at Kestrel Station that the Zarathi advance fleet had altered its projected course, angling more directly toward the border sector where our station was positioned. The news, when it reached us, produced exactly the reaction I had by then come to expect from my colleagues, which was to say, almost none at all beyond a slight tightening of operational schedules and an uptick in routine defensive drills that had, until that point, been running at a fairly relaxed cadence. I remember sitting in on one of these drills, watching a defense coordinator named Grace Whitfield, the very same administrator whose refusal to kneel had apparently started this entire chain of events, walk calmly through evacuation and defense procedures with the station's skeleton security detail. She had been transferred to Kestrel some weeks earlier, following the diplomatic incident at Ashworth's Landing, and I had expected, given her role in the war's origin, that she might carry some visible weight of guilt or anxiety about what her decision had set in motion. Instead, she ran the drill with the same brisk, practical efficiency she seemed to bring to everything, occasionally cracking a dry joke that made the younger security staff laugh despite the seriousness of the exercise. I approached her afterward, curiosity finally overcoming my hesitation, and asked her directly whether she ever regretted her decision not to kneel, given everything that had followed. She considered the question with the same unhurried practicality she brought to the drill, resting one hand on her hip as she thought it over. "No," she said finally, and there was no defensiveness in the answer, only a kind of settled certainty. "I don't regret it. I wasn't trying to start a war, Ellen. I want to be clear about that. I was just being myself, treating a stranger the way I'd treat anyone else who walked up to my door, with respect, but not with submission. If an empire that's lasted 11,000 years decided that was enough of an insult to justify all this, then I think that tells you something important about the empire, not about me." I asked her what she thought that told us. "It tells me they're used to getting their way through fear," she said. "It tells me nobody's ever really pushed back on them before, not in a way that mattered. And it tells me they've probably never had to deal with anybody who just wasn't built to be scared off that easily. I didn't plan on being a symbol of anything, but if I have to be one, I'd rather be a symbol of somebody who didn't fold than somebody who did. There was a quiet strength in the way she said it, something that settled into my chest and stayed there, a small anchor point in the midst of everything else that felt uncertain. I thought about Vale, and Osa, and all the departed allies who had looked at humanity's calm and seen only a mystery they weren't willing to risk their lives investigating. And I thought about Grace Whitfield, standing in a nearly empty drill hall, entirely unbothered by having accidentally become the spark that lit an interstellar war, simply because she had refused to bend her knees to a stranger. It occurred to me, watching her walk away to continue her duties, that perhaps this was the very thing Vale had been trying to warn me about, and had also, in some strange way, been trying to hope for. A civilization that did not fold under pressure, because folding had simply never been part of its instinctive vocabulary, not out of arrogance, but out of some deep, quiet conviction that dignity was not something to be traded away merely because someone powerful demanded it. The days that followed brought a steady stream of updates from Fleet Command, each one more concrete than the last. The Zarathi Advance Fleet had crossed the outer boundary of contested space. Its projected arrival at the border, near a modest human colony called Fenwick's Reach, was now measured in days rather than weeks. Kestrel Station, close enough to the colony to serve as an early warning post, found itself suddenly and undeniably at the leading edge of whatever was about to happen. I expected, finally, for the calm to break. I expected the ordinary rhythms of station life to give way, at last, to something more visibly urgent, and in some small ways, they did. Drills increased in frequency. Non-essential personnel were quietly reassigned to safer postings further from the border. Communication logs grew denser with military traffic, coded messages flowing between command and the approaching human defense fleet that was, I learned with some surprise, already positioned and waiting near Fenwick's Reach, weeks ahead of the Zarathi's actual arrival. But even amid these preparations, the underlying tone remained strikingly, stubbornly unchanged. Daniel still made his terrible coffee every morning. The station's small remaining contingent of families still gathered for meals in the canteen, still argued cheerfully about card games and sports scores. Grace Whitfield still cracked dry jokes during drills. It was as though humanity had found a way to hold two things at once: the seriousness of the approaching danger, and the simple, obstinate refusal to let that danger dictate the shape of daily life. And I began to understand, slowly, that this was not denial at all, as Vale had feared. It was preparation, wearing the clothing of calm. On the night before the Zarathi fleet was projected to arrive at Fenwick's Reach, I sat alone in the observation lounge, turning Osa's smooth stone over in my fingers, watching the star field beyond the viewport, and thinking about everyone who had already left, and everyone who had chosen to stay. Daniel found me there, as he so often did, and sat down beside me without a word for a long moment, simply watching the stars with me. "Scared?" he asked eventually. I told him yes, a little, and asked if he was too. "A little," he agreed. "But I keep coming back to something my grandmother used to say. She lived through some of the roughest years humanity ever had. Real hard years, the kind that don't make it into the polished history documentaries. She used to say that fear is just information, not instruction. It tells you something's dangerous. It doesn't get to tell you what to do about it. That part's still up to you." I asked him what he thought would happen tomorrow, when the Zarathi fleet finally arrived at Fenwick's Reach and found humanity's defenses waiting for them, instead of the panicked, submissive population their history had led them to expect. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the distant stars, and when he finally answered, there was something almost gentle in his voice, the tone of a man choosing his words carefully because he understood their weight. "I think," he said, "they're about to learn something that's going to surprise them a great deal more than it surprises us." The Zarathi fleet arrived at Fenwick's Reach at exactly the hour their own projections had promised, a detail I found darkly amusing, even in the tension of the moment, since it meant an empire capable of crossing the stars still could not resist the theatrical satisfaction of being punctual for its own intimidation display. I was not present at Fenwick's Reach itself. Kestrel Station sat close enough to receive real-time sensor data relayed from the human defense fleet stationed there, but far enough that I experienced the entire encounter the way I imagine most of humanity did, through a stream of data and static punctuated by brief, clipped voice transmissions from officers whose training kept their tone remarkably level, even as history unfolded around them. Daniel and I sat side by side in the signal room, watching the tactical display update in near real time, a cluster of 140 red markers advancing in that same disciplined wedge formation we had studied in the historical records, moving toward a much smaller cluster of blue markers, representing the human defense fleet, under the command of a woman named Noah Bishop, whose calm, steady voice would soon become, quite unexpectedly, one of the most replayed audio clips in recent galactic history. The Zorathi fleet broadcast a final message as it closed the distance, the same ritual language we had grown almost accustomed to over the preceding weeks, warnings of judgment, references to inevitable submission, an invitation, almost gracious in its condescension, for humanity to reconsider and offer surrender before the engagement began in earnest. Fleet Commander Bishop's response, when it came, was recorded and later broadcast across every human network, and I have listened to it more times than I could count in the months that followed. "We appreciate the offer," she said, her voice utterly without drama, as though she were declining a routine meeting invitation, rather than an ultimatum from an empire 11,000 years old. "But we're going to have to pass. Feel free to turn around any time. The offer stands both ways." There was a pause on the Zorathi channel, long enough that I wondered if the translation systems on their end had simply failed to process a response, so far outside their expectations. When their reply finally came, it carried a different quality than the earlier broadcasts, something sharper, almost affronted, as though the fleet commanding this ancient and eternal empire genuinely could not comprehend that its offer of clemency had simply been declined without so much as a counteroffer. The engagement began shortly afterward. I want to describe what followed as carefully and honestly as I can, because so much of what made it remarkable was not the engagement itself, but the manner in which it unfolded, the strange, almost surreal contrast between the scale of the danger and the composure of everyone involved. The Zorathi fleet advanced according to the same doctrine that had apparently served them for centuries, a coordinated wedge designed to overwhelm through sheer disciplined mass, each ship maintaining precise formation, weapon systems synchronizing their targeting in a manner clearly meant to project inevitability. It was, by every historical account we had access to, exactly the kind of formation that had ended the resistance of dozens of other civilizations before a shot was ever properly exchanged, the sight of it alone sufficient to break the nerve of most defenders. Humanity's defense fleet did not hold formation the way the Zorathi expected. Commander Bishop's ships scattered into a pattern that looked, on the tactical display, almost chaotic, individual vessels breaking away from any recognizable structure, moving with what I would only later understand was a carefully rehearsed unpredictability, a doctrine built specifically around the principle that a disciplined enemy could not effectively target what it could not first anticipate. Daniel leaned forward beside me, watching the display with an intensity I had not seen from him before, and explained, in a low voice, what he was seeing. "They're not panicking," he said. "That's the thing the Zorathi don't understand yet. This looks like disorder to them, because their whole doctrine is built around predictable, disciplined formations. But every one of our ships knows exactly where every other one of our ships is going next. It's not chaos. It's a language the Zorathi haven't learned to read." The engagement that followed lasted just under 2 hours, a span of time that felt, to me, both impossibly long and strangely brief, compressed by the intensity of watching a tactical display shift and change in ways I struggled to fully interpret in real time. What became clear, even to someone without formal military training, was that the Zorathi fleet's rigid formation, so effective at intimidation, proved remarkably vulnerable to a defense that refused to engage it on its own terms. Human vessels darted through gaps in the wedge formation that the Zorathi's targeting systems, calibrated for centuries against enemies who fought in predictable lines, simply could not adjust to quickly enough. Communication intercepts, translated in fragments by our systems, revealed a Zorathi command structure growing increasingly confused, orders contradicting previous orders, formation commanders requesting clarification on tactics that no longer seemed to be working as intended. By the time the Zorathi fleet finally broke formation and began a disorganized retreat, having sustained losses that our own analysts estimated at nearly a third of their original number, with human losses remarkably, almost unbelievably light by comparison, I found myself sitting in stunned silence beside Daniel, the tactical display finally settling into a quiet, resolved state that felt almost anticlimactic after the tension of the preceding hours. Commander Bishop's final transmission of the engagement, sent openly across all channels including, deliberately, the frequencies the Zorathi themselves monitored, was even shorter than her earlier response. "Thanks for stopping by," she said. "Try the kneeling thing somewhere else next time. It's really not going to work out for you here." I laughed, a startled, disbelieving sound, and beside me Daniel was grinning, shaking his head slowly. "That's going to end up in a history book somewhere," he said. "Mark my words." The aftermath of the engagement brought a flood of activity to Kestrel Station, reports flowing in from every direction, analysis teams scrambling to make sense of exactly what had happened and why the Zorathi's supposedly superior fleet had suffered such a dramatic and unexpected setback against a defense force that had, on paper, been substantially outnumbered. What emerged over the following days, pieced together from intercepted communications, sensor logs, and the calm, measured after-action reports filed by Commander Bishop and her officers, painted a picture that I found genuinely fascinating, not merely as a matter of military curiosity, but as a window into something deeper about how humanity approached conflict itself. The Zorathi doctrine, refined over 11,000 years of largely successful conquest, was built around the assumption that overwhelming, disciplined force, combined with the psychological weight of an empire's fearsome reputation, would be sufficient to either prevent resistance entirely or crush it swiftly when it occurred. It was a doctrine built for predictable opponents, civilizations that fought according to recognizable patterns, that could be studied, anticipated, and outmaneuvered through superior coordination. Humanity's military doctrine, by contrast, had been shaped by a very different history, one defined not by centuries of unbroken conquest, but by generations of adapting to constantly shifting circumstances, learning through hard experience that rigid predictability was itself a vulnerability, that flexibility and the willingness to improvise under pressure often mattered more than raw numerical or technological superiority. "It was," Daniel explained to me one evening as we reviewed the after-action reports together, "less a single unified strategy than a deeply ingrained cultural instinct, the product of a species that had simply never had the luxury of assuming any single approach would work against every future threat. We've never really had the option of getting comfortable," he said, scrolling through the tactical logs. "Every time humanity thought it had things figured out, something came along and proved otherwise. Doesn't matter if you're talking about wars, disasters, or just plain bad luck. We got real good real fast at throwing out the plan when the plan stopped working, and coming up with something new on the spot. The Zorathi have had 11,000 years of things basically going according to plan. That's a dangerous kind of comfortable to have." Word of the engagement at Fenwick's Reach spread quickly, not only through human channels but, we soon learned, through the wider galactic community as well. Reports reached us, relayed through the few neutral trade contacts still willing to maintain communication with human territory, that the news had caused significant unrest within Zorathi-controlled space. An empire that had built its entire reputation on the inevitability of its conquests had suffered a defeat that could not easily be explained away or hidden from its own citizens and subject worlds. I thought often, during those days, about Vale and Osa, wondering whether news of the engagement had reached them, wondering whether it might ease the fear that had driven them to leave. I found myself hoping, with a quiet intensity, that somewhere out among the stars, they were hearing the reports and reconsidering the pattern they had believed humanity was destined to follow. Grace Whitfield, when I passed her in the station corridor a few days after the engagement, looked much the same as she always had, unbothered and practical, though I noticed a certain lightness in her step that had not been there in the tense weeks leading up to the battle. "Heard the news," I said, and she nodded. "Good outcome," she said simply. "Didn't want it to come to that, but I can't say I'm surprised at how it went." I asked her if she had expected the engagement to unfold the way it had. "I trust our people," she said. "I trust the folks who train for this, who think about this stuff for a living. I never had any illusions this would be easy, but I never doubted we'd hold our ground either. That's not arrogance, Ellen. It's just knowing who you're standing with. That evening, I sat once more in the observation lounge, Osa's smooth stone resting in my palm, watching the star field beyond the viewport, and allowed myself, for the first time since the declaration had first arrived, a small, cautious feeling of hope. The war was far from over. Everyone at Kestrel Station understood that the engagement at Fenwick's Reach, however encouraging, was likely only the opening moment of a much longer and more difficult conflict still to come. But something had shifted, quietly and unmistakably, in the balance of the story unfolding around us. An empire that had never known defeat had just tasted it, delivered not by superior numbers or technology, but by a species that had simply refused to fight the war, on the terms its enemy had assumed were the only terms available. Somewhere beyond the border, in the depths of Zorathi-controlled space, I imagined a very different kind of meeting taking place than the calm, unbothered gatherings I had witnessed aboard Kestrel Station in the weeks prior. A meeting filled with confusion, recalculation, and the first uncomfortable stirrings of doubt within a civilization that had never before been forced to consider the possibility that its ancient certainties might not hold against everyone it encountered. I did not know it yet, but that meeting, and the doubt it planted, would prove to matter far more than any single battle in the long, strange war that still lay ahead of us. News of the engagement at Fenwick's Reach did more than simply travel through official diplomatic channels. It spread the way stories always spread, once they escaped the neat boundaries of official reports, growing stranger and more exaggerated with each retelling, until the version that eventually circulated through Zorathi-controlled space bore only a passing resemblance to the actual, comparatively modest battle that had taken place. I learned most of this secondhand, through intercepted transmissions that our analysts had gathered and translated over the following weeks, supplemented by fragments of information passed along through the handful of neutral trade contacts still willing to maintain a cautious, distant relationship with human territory. Piecing it together felt, at times, like assembling a portrait of my own species, as seen through a badly distorted mirror, one that reflected something recognizable, but strange, exaggerated in ways that were sometimes flattering and sometimes deeply unsettling. Daniel brought me one such transmission early one morning, a piece of captured Zorathi military correspondence that our translation systems had finally rendered into readable English after days of processing the unfamiliar dialect used among their officer corps. "You need to read this," he said, setting the printout on my desk with an expression I could not quite place, somewhere between amusement and genuine unease. The document was a report filed by a Zorathi officer who had survived the retreat from Fenwick's Reach, addressed to a superior, whose title our systems translated, roughly, as Fleet Overseer. The officer described the engagement in terms that bore little resemblance to what I had actually watched unfold on our own tactical displays. According to the report, the human fleet had displayed what the officer called an absence of recognizable fear response, moving through the engagement with what he described as unnatural calm, executing maneuvers that defied standard predictive modeling in ways that suggested either an entirely alien tactical philosophy or, and here the officer's language grew notably more anxious, the possibility that humans simply did not experience combat stress in any way comparable to other known species. I read the passage twice, startled by how far the interpretation had drifted from the reality I understood. The human fleet had been afraid. I knew that much from the after-action reports Commander Bishop herself had filed, candid documents that spoke plainly about the tension and uncertainty her officers had carried into the engagement. But that fear had never translated into hesitation, and somewhere in the translation between what actually happened and what the surviving Zorathi officer had witnessed and reported, an entirely different narrative had taken shape, one that painted humanity as something closer to an unfeeling, unstoppable anomaly than the anxious, determined people I knew us to be. "That's not what happened," I said to Daniel, half laughing at the absurdity of it. "They were terrified. I read Bishop's own report. Half her officers said their hands were shaking before the engagement even started." "Doesn't matter what actually happened," Daniel said. "Matters what they believe happened. And right now, what they believe is starting to look a lot scarier than the truth." Over the following weeks, this pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency. Each new intercepted transmission, adding another layer to a mythology, forming around humanity, that grew steadily more exaggerated with distance from the actual events. Reports described human soldiers as entities who felt no need for rest, who fought with what one particularly anxious transmission called a serene and terrible patience, who treated the declaration of an 11,000-year-old empire's wrath with what the same officer described, almost plaintively, as the same weight most species reserved for minor scheduling inconveniences. I found myself both amused and troubled by this growing legend, aware that it captured something true about my species, even as it distorted the specifics almost beyond recognition. Humanity was not fearless, not in the way the Zarathi reports increasingly described. But we had, I was beginning to understand more clearly with each passing week, developed a particular relationship with fear that apparently looked, from the outside, indistinguishable from its complete absence. A relationship built on generations of practice at feeling afraid and choosing to act anyway, until the choosing itself became so automatic that it no longer looked like a choice at all to anyone watching from outside. Vale reached out to me during this period, the first contact I had received since their departure weeks earlier. A brief message relayed through the diplomatic channels that still connected human territory to the wider neutral network. "I have heard the reports from Fenwick's Reach," the message read. "I confess I do not fully understand what I am hearing. Some of what is being said sounds impossible. I find myself, for the first time since I left, uncertain whether my caution was wisdom or simply fear dressed in more respectable clothing. I hope, sincerely, that you are well." I wrote back at length, trying to give Vale a truer picture than the increasingly mythologized reports circulating through Zarathi space, describing the actual fear Commander Bishop's officers had carried into the engagement, the very human uncertainty that had accompanied even the most decisive moments of the battle. I did not want Vale, or anyone else watching from outside, to believe that humanity had won through some inhuman absence of feeling. I wanted them to understand that we had won, if that was even the right word for a single engagement in a much longer war, precisely because we had learned to carry our fear alongside our actions, rather than letting it dictate them. Vale's reply came several days later, shorter than their first message but carrying, even through the flat medium of text, something that felt like genuine relief. "That is a far more comforting explanation than the one currently circulating among my own people," they wrote. "I confess I much prefer a species that feels fear and chooses courage over one that simply does not feel at all. The former seems a foundation worth trusting. The latter would have troubled me greatly." Meanwhile, within Zarathi space itself, the growing mythology around humanity was producing effects that our analysts found genuinely fascinating to track. Intercepted communications revealed a Zarathi command structure increasingly divided over how to proceed. Some officers arguing that the engagement at Fenwick's Reach represented a statistical anomaly that a larger, more carefully prepared assault would easily correct, while others, their language growing noticeably more cautious with each passing week, began questioning whether the Empire's traditional doctrine of psychological intimidation, followed by overwhelming force, was even applicable to an opponent who appeared, at least according to the reports reaching them, to have simply declined to be intimidated in the first place. One particular transmission, intercepted roughly a month after the engagement at Fenwick's Reach, captured what our analysts believed to be a direct address from a senior Zarathi military commander to assembled officers preparing for a subsequent campaign. Our translation systems rendered his words with a formality that felt, to my ear, almost desperate in its insistence on traditional confidence. "The humans are not invulnerable," the commander insisted, according to the transcript. "They bleed as any species bleeds. They can be defeated as any species can be defeated. Do not allow rumor and exaggeration to convince you otherwise. Our empire has stood for 11,000 years. It will not fall to a single unexpected setback at the hands of a species that has not yet learned the true scale of what it has provoked." Daniel and I read this transmission together, and I remember him tapping the printout thoughtfully, a small, knowing smile crossing his face. "Listen to that," he said. "That's not the voice of a commander who's confident. That's the voice of a commander trying real hard to convince himself, and everybody listening, that he still believes what he's saying." I asked him what he thought that meant for what was coming next. "It means the fight isn't over," he said, his tone growing more serious. If anything, it probably means the next move they make is going to be bigger, more desperate, more determined to prove the first engagement was a fluke. Empires that build their whole identity around being unbeatable don't handle the first crack in that identity well. They tend to double down rather than step back and reconsider. His prediction, as it turned out, was not far from what unfolded in the weeks that followed. Sensor networks along the border began detecting a significant new mobilization within Zorathi territory, fleet numbers considerably larger than the force that had been repelled at Fenwick's Reach, gathering with what our analysts described as a deliberate, almost theatrical show of force, clearly intended to erase the memory of the earlier defeat through sheer, undeniable scale. Kestrel Station's atmosphere shifted subtly in response to this news, though the fundamental rhythm of daily life remained, as it always had, stubbornly intact. Drills increased once more, command traffic grew denser, but the canteen still filled each evening with the same familiar conversations, the same card games, the same dry, understated humor that I had come to recognize as humanity's particular way of holding fear without letting it take the wheel. I found Grace Whitfield in the observation lounge one evening during this tense stretch, watching the star field with an expression more thoughtful than I had seen from her before. "Bigger fleet coming," I said, more statement than question, and she nodded. "Figured they would," she said. "Wounded pride tends to come back swinging harder the second time. That's not unique to the Zorathi. Seen it plenty of times closer to home, too." I asked her if she was worried the larger fleet might succeed where the first had failed. She considered the question with her usual unhurried practicality, resting her forearms against the viewport railing. "I'd be foolish not to take it seriously," she said. "Bigger numbers matter, no question about that. But numbers alone didn't win them the first engagement, and I don't think numbers alone are going to win them the next one either. What beat them at Fenwick's Reach wasn't some clever trick. It was just us, being ourselves, refusing to fight the fight the way they expected. I don't see any reason that stops working just because they bring more ships along for the second attempt." Her confidence, quiet and unshaken, settled something in me that had been sitting uneasily in my chest since the first reports of the new Zorathi mobilization had reached the station. I thought again of Osa's smooth stone, still resting in the small drawer beside my bunk, a promise of return that I found myself holding on to with a fierceness that surprised me each time I remembered it was there. Whatever the Zorathi Empire was preparing to send against us next, I understood, standing there beside Grace Whitfield in the quiet observation lounge, that humanity would meet it the same way we had met everything else since the Declaration first arrived weeks earlier, not with the fearless, mythologized certainty the increasingly exaggerated reports from Zorathi space seemed to believe, but with something I had come to think was far sturdier than fearlessness ever could be, a fear acknowledged, carried, and set quietly aside each morning in favor of the work that needed doing. Somewhere beyond the border, an empire that had never known real resistance was gathering its strength for a second attempt, still convinced, despite everything, that scale alone would finally deliver the submission it had always assumed was inevitable. I found myself, watching the stars that evening, almost pitying the confusion that still awaited them. The second Zorathi fleet arrived at the border, 6 weeks after the engagement at Fenwick's Reach, and this time, there was no mistaking the scale of what the Empire had assembled. Sensor networks along Kestrel Station's monitoring range counted just over 400 vessels, more than double the earlier fleet's numbers, moving in a formation our analysts described as noticeably different from the disciplined wedge we had studied before, wider, more layered, clearly designed to correct whatever vulnerabilities had been exposed in the first engagement. I remember sitting with Daniel in the signal room as the reports came in, watching the tactical display fill with an almost overwhelming density of markers, and feeling a knot of genuine apprehension settle into my chest that I did not try to hide or minimize this time. 400 ships was not an abstraction. It was a number large enough to make even the most stubbornly calm among us pause. Daniel noticed my expression and set a hand briefly on my shoulder, a small, steadying gesture that had become familiar over the preceding weeks. "Big number?" he agreed, following my gaze to the display. "But you know what I keep coming back to. Numbers only matter if the strategy behind them actually works. They didn't fix the problem that beat them the first time. They just brought more of the same problem, dressed up bigger." His words proved, over the following days, to carry more truth than even he had perhaps expected. Fleet Commander Bishop's forces, reinforced by additional squadrons drawn from human territories further from the border, met the expanded Zarathi advance with the same fundamental doctrine that had served them at Fenwick's Reach, refusing predictable formation, trusting individual initiative within a broader coordinated framework, treating the engagement not as a single decisive clash, but as an evolving, adaptive contest that could shift its shape moment to moment. What made this second engagement different, and what I found most remarkable watching it unfold through the relayed sensor data, was the growing evidence of hesitation within the Zarathi fleet itself. Intercepted communications, translated in near real time by systems that had grown considerably more sophisticated at parsing Zarathi military dialect over the preceding weeks, revealed officers second-guessing orders, requesting confirmation before executing maneuvers that should have been routine, a creeping uncertainty running through a chain of command that had, until recently, prided itself on unwavering discipline. Something is wrong with their targeting predictions, one intercepted transmission read, attributed to a mid-ranking Zarathi tactical officer addressing a subordinate. They do not fight as the reports described. They fight as though they know what we intend before we intend it. This cannot be coincidence. I do not know how to counter an enemy whose behavior I cannot model. Daniel, reading this transmission over my shoulder, let out a low whistle. "That right there," he said, tapping the printout. "That's the sound of a doctrine breaking down in real time. They've spent 11,000 years building a war machine around the assumption that fear makes people predictable. They've never had to fight anybody who just doesn't fold that way." The engagement stretched across nearly 6 hours, considerably longer than the first, and I found myself, alongside Daniel and much of the rest of the signal room staff, watching the tactical display with an intensity that made the hours feel simultaneously endless and impossibly brief. There were tense stretches where the sheer numerical advantage of the Zarathi fleet threatened to overwhelm Commander Bishop's more limited forces through simple attrition, moments where I genuinely did not know how the engagement would resolve. But the pattern that had defined Fenwick's Reach reasserted itself as the hours wore on, the Zarathi's numerical advantage steadily eroded by a defense that continued to exploit the gap between their rigid doctrine and the messy, adaptive reality of actual combat. By the time the engagement finally concluded, the Zarathi fleet had suffered losses that our analysts estimated at nearly half its original strength, a staggering toll that no amount of numerical advantage had been able to prevent. The retreat, when it came, carried a different character than the first engagement's orderly withdrawal. Intercepted communications described confusion bordering on disarray within the Zarathi command structure, orders and counter-orders overlapping as officers struggled to organize a coherent retreat in the face of losses far beyond anything their doctrine had prepared them to absorb. In the days that followed, our analysts began piecing together a picture of the wider consequences rippling through Zarathi space, drawn from an increasingly rich stream of intercepted communications and the cautious reports still trickling in through neutral trade contacts. What emerged was a portrait of an empire in genuine crisis, its ancient certainty about its own inevitability, shaken not merely by 2 military defeats, but by the growing realization among its own officer corps that the empire's fundamental approach to warfare, refined and unquestioned across 11,000 years, might simply be inadequate against an opponent who had never learned to play by its rules. One particularly striking transmission, intercepted several weeks after the second engagement, appeared to be a message from a junior Zarathi officer to family members back in core Imperial territory, the kind of personal correspondence that occasionally slipped through military channels despite official restrictions. Our translation systems rendered it with a plainness that felt, to me, more affecting than any of the formal military reports that had preceded it. "I do not know how to explain what I have witnessed," the officer wrote. "We were taught that fear is the foundation of order, that a species which does not fear us cannot help but eventually submit, worn down by the weight of an inevitability they cannot escape. I no longer believe this is true of the humans. They fight as though they have already decided the outcome does not frighten them, and I confess, this frightens me more than anything I have encountered in my service. I do not know what kind of species raises its children to face an empire without trembling. I am not certain I wish to find out through further conflict." Daniel and I read this particular transmission together in silence. And I remember feeling, for the first time, something closer to sympathy than triumph. A strange, unexpected tenderness toward an enemy officer whose fear, laid bare in a private letter never meant for our eyes, felt achingly human despite everything that separated us. "They're not monsters," I said quietly. "They're just people who've never had to question what they were taught." Daniel nodded slowly. "Doesn't make what they're doing right," he said. "Doesn't mean we back off or apologize for standing our ground. But yeah, I think you're right. Somewhere under all that ceremony and doctrine, there's just a lot of scared people following orders from an empire that's never had to admit it might be wrong about something. That's a hard thing to be the first generation to figure out." The weeks following the second engagement brought a noticeable shift in the tone of the intercepted Zarathi communications, a slow but unmistakable fracturing of the confident, ceremonial language that had characterized the Empire's initial declaration of war. Reports of internal debate grew more frequent. Officers and administrators across multiple Zarathi-held territories openly questioning, in tones our analysts had never before observed in their communications, whether the campaign against humanity should continue at all. One transmission, attributed to a regional Zarathi governor addressing a council of subordinate administrators, captured this shifting mood with particular clarity. "We have expended considerable resources and considerable lives pursuing a conflict that grows increasingly difficult to justify to our own people," the governor argued, according to the translated transcript. "The original grievance that began this war grows more absurd with each retelling, a diplomatic slight over a gesture of respect, met with a response that has cost us dearly and gained us nothing but a reputation for stubbornness that ill suits an empire that prides itself on wisdom. I would ask this council to consider, seriously, whether continued pursuit of this campaign serves the empire, or merely the wounded pride of those who initiated it." The governor's words, we later learned through subsequent intercepts, had not been received warmly by the war's original architects, but they represented a crack in the unified imperial narrative that had not existed before, a crack that seemed, with each passing week, to widen rather than close. Kestrel Station itself settled, during this period, into a strange new rhythm, neither the anxious anticipation of the war's earliest weeks nor the full relaxation of peacetime, but something in between, a cautious, watchful calm that acknowledged the ongoing danger without allowing it to consume the ordinary business of daily life. Drills continued, reports continued, but there was, unmistakably, a lighter quality to the conversations I overheard in the canteen each evening, a sense that the tide, while far from fully turned, had at least stopped running entirely in the Empire's favor. Grace Whitfield summed up the mood best, I thought, during a brief conversation we shared one evening in the observation lounge, watching the star field beyond the viewport, with the particular stillness that had become one of my favorite parts of station life. "We're not done," she said, when I asked her how she read the shifting reports from Zarathi space. "Not even close, probably. Empires like that don't just fold because they lose a couple of fights and a governor gets cold feet. But I'll tell you what I do think. I think they're starting to realize this isn't going to be the easy lesson in obedience they expected to teach us. And once an empire starts doubting its own certainty, that doubt has a way of spreading, whether the people at the top want it to or not." I asked her what she thought would happen next. She considered the question for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the distant stars. "I think," she said finally, "we're about to find out whether an empire that's built its entire identity around never losing knows how to handle actually losing. And in my experience, that's usually a far harder lesson for an empire to learn than any single battle ever could be." The end of the war, when it finally came, did not arrive the way I had imagined it would during those first tense weeks after the declaration. Back when I sat alone in the signal room watching a violet alert blink on my console, and wondered whether humanity fully understood what it had just been threatened with. There was no final, decisive battle, no dramatic surrender ceremony broadcast to every corner of known space. Instead, the war ended the way so much of it had unfolded from the very beginning, quietly, almost anticlimactically, in a manner that seemed to catch the wider galaxy far more off guard than it caught humanity itself. It began, as far as our analysts could determine, with a formal request for negotiation, transmitted through neutral diplomatic channels, roughly 4 months after the declaration, addressed not to any human military authority, but to the broader Council of Neutral Worlds that had been cautiously monitoring the conflict from a careful distance. The request, translated and forwarded to Human Command within hours of its arrival, asked for a mediated dialogue regarding what the Zorathi transmission called, with a formality that felt almost sheepish given everything that had preceded it, a reassessment of hostilities in light of evolving strategic considerations. I was present in the signal room when the request came through, and I remember Daniel reading it over my shoulder, letting out a short, disbelieving laugh. Evolving strategic considerations, he repeated. That's one way to put it, I suppose. The negotiations that followed stretched across several weeks, conducted primarily through the same neutral Thrinian channels that had first carried the Empire's declaration of war to human space so many months earlier. I did not have direct access to the details of those discussions, which were handled by diplomatic officials far above my station, but the general shape of the outcome filtered down to us in stages. Each new report met with the same measured, unhurried satisfaction that had characterized humanity's response to nearly everything since the conflict began. The Zorathi Empire, it emerged, had not been brought to the negotiating table by any single military defeat, however costly those defeats had proven. It had been brought there by something far more corrosive to an empire built on the foundation of unquestioned inevitability, a spreading crisis of confidence among its own people and administrators, who had watched two major campaigns fail to produce the swift, terrified submission that 11,000 years of history had led them to expect, and who had begun, in growing numbers, to question whether the war's continuation served any purpose beyond preserving the wounded pride of those who had started it. Vale reached out to me again during this period, their message carrying a tone considerably lighter than the anxious correspondence we had exchanged in the war's earlier months. I have been granted permission to return to Kestrel Station once negotiations conclude, they wrote. I find myself, against my earlier expectations, eager to do so. I have spent these months studying reports of your species with a fascination I did not anticipate feeling. I believe I owe you an apology, Ellen, though I am still working out precisely how to phrase it in a manner that captures the full complexity of what I have come to understand. I wrote back that no apology was necessary, that their caution had never felt like betrayal to me, only the reasonable response of someone who had seen a pattern play out badly too many times before, to risk trusting an exception without proof. Perhaps, Vale replied, but I think there is something worth naming plainly nonetheless. I judged your species by the shape of a pattern I had learned from others, and I was wrong to assume the pattern would hold without question. I am grateful, more than I can easily express, to have been wrong about this particular thing. The formal terms of the peace agreement, when they were finally announced, proved almost anticlimactic in their specifics: a mutual withdrawal from contested border territories, formal recognition of human sovereignty over the colonies the Zorathi had originally threatened, and, in a detail that struck me as almost comically fitting given everything that had started this entire conflict, an explicit clause specifying that future diplomatic exchanges between the two peoples would no longer require any ceremonial gesture of physical submission from either party. I remember reading that particular clause aloud to Daniel in the canteen the evening the terms were announced, and the two of us laughing until we had to set our trays down, a release of tension that had been building, in some quiet corner of both of us, across the entire preceding 4 months. All that, Daniel said, still shaking his head. Hundreds of ships. All that fear, and all those losses on both sides. And it ends with basically an agreement that nobody has to bow to anybody else ever again. Grace Whitfield could have told them that from the start, if they'd just asked nicely instead of declaring war over it. The broadcast of the final peace treaty signing, when it aired across human networks a week later, received, true to form, considerably less public attention than the season finale of a popular sports tournament airing that same evening. I watched the signing ceremony alone in the observation lounge, a modest, understated affair conducted through a secure diplomatic relay, human and Zorathi representatives exchanging formal statements with a stiffness that suggested neither side was entirely comfortable with the process yet, though both seemed, in their own reserved ways, genuinely relieved that the conflict had reached its conclusion. Grace Whitfield joined me partway through the broadcast, settling into the seat beside mine with a quiet, satisfied expression. "Well," she said, watching the screen, "guess that's that." I asked her how it felt, knowing that a diplomatic incident she had been at the very center of, however unintentionally, had ultimately shaped the outcome of an interstellar war. She considered the question for a long moment before answering, her gaze fixed on the formal, careful exchange playing out on the screen before us. "Feels like it always should have felt," she said finally. "Like two people's figuring out, the hard way, that respect doesn't have to look like submission, and that you can hold your ground without needing to make anybody else feel small for holding theirs. I wish it hadn't taken a war to get there, but I can't say I regret how we handled it once the war showed up anyway." Osa returned to Kestrel Station 3 weeks after the treaty's formal signing, her familiar trading vessel docking at the station's ring, with the same easy confidence I remembered from before her departure so many months earlier. She found me in the observation lounge, the same spot where we had said our farewells, and I held up the smooth stone she had left in my care, still carefully kept in the drawer beside my bunk through everything that had followed. "I believe this belongs to you," I said, and she laughed, that same soft, musical sound I had missed more than I realized during the long months of her absence. "Keep it," she said, closing my fingers back around the stone. "Consider it a permanent reminder of a promise kept, on both our parts. I promised I would return, and you, it seems, promised something far larger to the entire galaxy, whether you meant to or not." Vale arrived not long after, and the reunion of our small, strange found family aboard Kestrel Station felt, in its quiet way, like its own small and fitting conclusion to everything that had come before. We gathered that evening in the station's canteen, a mixed group of humans and Threnian sharing a meal together, the same easy, unbothered conversation flowing around the table that had characterized life aboard the station since long before the war had ever begun, though now carrying an added warmth, the particular gratitude of people who had weathered something difficult together and come out the other side largely intact. I still think about that first violet alert sometimes, the strange color blinking on my console in the quiet hours of an otherwise unremarkable night shift, the beginning of a chain of events that had, in the end, reshaped an ancient empire's entire understanding of itself far more thoroughly than it had ever reshaped humanity. We had not gone to war seeking to teach anyone a lesson. We had simply continued being exactly what we had always been, a species that carried its fear alongside its actions, rather than letting fear make its decisions for it, that valued dignity without needing to strip it from anyone else, that showed up for the ordinary business of living, even when the extraordinary threatened to consume everything around it. The galaxy, I understood by then, had learned something important about humanity through those difficult months, a lesson that would likely shape how other species approached us for generations to come. But I like to think, sitting in that warm, crowded canteen surrounded by friends both old and newly returned, that the more important lesson had been one humanity already knew about itself long before any empire ever announced its displeasure over an unbowed knee. We had never needed a war to prove our strength. We had simply needed, when the war arrived uninvited at our door anyway, to keep being exactly who we already were, and to trust that this, in the end, would be more than enough.